Howdy, folks. We're going to get things started now. The room is filling up. I think we're doing fine. So, Nate Schweber is a writer and journalist whose latest book is This America of Ours, Bernard and Avis DeVoto and the Forgotten Fight to Save the Wild. Also, clearly, Nate has the most friends in Missoula.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you so much. It's so awesome and lovely to see all of you here today. New friends and old friends and teachers. It's really an honor to be in Missoula, Montana, my hometown, and I know your time is very valuable, so I really appreciate you coming to spend some of your afternoon with me so I can talk about my new book, This America of Ours, Bernard and Avis DeVoto and the Forgotten Fight to Save the Wild. Out of curiosity, by a show of hands, I use the word forgotten in my subtitle. How many of you are familiar with Bernard DeVoto, by a show of hands? All right, excellent. Well, some of you, God bless you, have read my book. I'm going to say Bernard, by the way. The DeVotos had two sons. Their youngest is still alive. He's 82 years old. He let me know that it's pronounced Bernard, not Bernard, the English way, so I'll be saying that. What about Avis DeVoto? Anybody a fan of Avis DeVoto, who's kind of more prominent in pop culture today for reasons I will touch on? Well, it's really excellent to see that there are some devotees here today. I'm not proud to admit this, but despite the fact that I grew up here 90 minutes from this, I never knew who Bernard DeVoto was until I picked up one of his books in New York City, where I live now. This is the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. It's on the top of the Bitterroot Mountains. It's along Highway 12 on the divide between Montana and Idaho, just on the Idaho side of the divide. It's in the Clearwater National Forest. I'm going to talk a little bit about why the DeVotos are so honored on our public lands for the role that they played in the McCarthy era to protect and preserve our public lands. This is Bernard DeVoto in 1954. He's going to point at what started his interest in conservation. This is his maternal grandpa's farm at the base of the Wasatch Mountains, just outside of Ogden, Utah. Bernard was born in Ogden in 1897. Family lore has it that he was such a beautiful baby that he won beauty contests. Those days were numbered. This is his mother, Rhoda. She's a Jack Mormon. She will die in the 1918 flu pandemic. But her father, Samuel, he emigrated from rainy England to desert Utah in the middle of the 1800s when he converted to Mormonism, and he became a farmer. And that was an enormous challenge, coming from a rainy place to a dry place. And sometimes in New York, people who know that I grew up in Montana will ask me, what is up with public lands? Why did they come from the West? Why are there so many in the West? What's the point? And the point is what Bernard DeVoto's grandfather figured out, which was the same thing that the ancestral Puebloans figured out 1,000 years before, is that unlike in England and in the eastern U.S., where precipitation to sustain a farm comes from the sky as rain, in the West it gathers as snow on the top of mountains. And in order to have survivable communities in the valleys below, that snow melt has to get safely and cleanly down the mountains to the valleys. And that made a huge impression on young Bernard, who was 10 years old when President Theodore Roosevelt created the Wasatch National Forest to protect the mountains around Utah and the water that came from them. One of his chores was helping out on his grandpa's farm. Despite how much he loved the West, he was ferociously and fearsomely smart. And so in 1915, he went to Harvard University. When World War I broke out, he enlisted in the Army. This is a photo of him in uniform. You can see by his nose that his days of winning beauty contests are behind him. He had his nose shattered by a bat in an attempt when he was a kid to play baseball. Though he was not athletically gifted, he was awesomely intellectually gifted, and he knew it. When he was in his early 20s, he wrote, "My mind is as good as there is." But while his mind was as good as there was, his heart was not as good as it could be until in 1922 at Northwestern University, he met the love of his life, Helen Avis McVicker. Avis DeVoto was born in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in 1904, surrounded on all sides by Lake Superior. That's her in the front of the canoe there. She was very vivacious. She was very spirited. She was also very graceful and stylish and beautiful. But above everything else, Avis DeVoto was daring and she was fearless. And she and Bernard DeVoto were drawn to each other because of a mutual love of books. And they dreamed of creating literature together. And they also had a very similar sense of humor. But it wasn't just the ways that they were alike that drew them together. It was also the ways that they were opposite but complementary. Bernard loved to write. Avis loved to edit. Bernard loved attention. Avis loved her privacy. Bernard loved to eat. Avis loved to cook and was fascinated all her life with cooking. Remember that. This is the first photograph of the DeVotos together. This is them on their honeymoon in 1923. But Avis could never truly know her husband until she knew where he was from, the Rocky Mountain West. So in 1925, Bernard brought Avis to Ogden, Utah to meet her father-in-law, his dad, Florian DeVoto. He had come west on the Transcontinental Railroad and worked as a land title abstractor for the Union Pacific Railroad. And he wanted to show Avis what had been a paradise in his youth, the Wasatch National Forest, the mountains. So they rented a little cabin in an alpine valley. But when Bernard got there, he was horrified by what he saw. In order to boost lumber production during World War I, logging regulations were lifted, but then never put back in place in peacetime. And in order to boost beef and wool production, grazing regulations were lifted, but then never put back in place in peacetime. And when the DeVotos were there, a rainstorm hit and a flash flood came at them, and it almost killed them. And the DeVotos got off a lot better than a lot of Westerners in the 1920s. Floods devastated the West. Pueblo, Colorado, Escalante, Utah, Silver City, Nevada, always for the same reason, for conservation failures. Been grazed almost to extinction was the postmortem. So where working on his grandpa's farm made DeVoto understand the importance of public lands, it was these floods in the 1920s that made him understand the importance of protecting public lands. And that passion, which both of the DeVotos shared for their entire lives, would pit them against the great nemesis of their lives, Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. This is another forgotten figure in history, and he shouldn't be, because hardly anybody in American history was more powerful, paranoid, corrupt, greedy, vengeful, and absolutely genius than Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. Early Nevada was so corrupt it was known as the Rotten Borough, and Pat McCarran embodied that. His dream was for Nevada to be like a gated community for the richest Americans, so he catered to people who owned mansions at Lake Tahoe and who had ecologically dead but beautiful desert vistas on their vanity ranches in the deserts. And the Roaring Twenties were followed by the Dirty Thirties, and in order to fight the Dust Bowl, Franklin Roosevelt created a conservation agency that was to be a sibling agency to the one his fifth cousin Theodore created. Teddy Roosevelt made the Forest Service. Franklin Roosevelt made an agency called the Grazing Service, and the Grazing Service was to protect the dry prairies and deserts in the western United States, and Pat McCarran went to war against the Grazing Service, and he did it in a very manipulative and duplicitous way. He announced he was going to have open public meetings all across the West where any citizen could come and give feedback about public lands. But secretly, Pat McCarran allowed only his cronies to stage manage these meetings, the West's biggest cattle ranchers and wool growers. So consequently, voices that McCarran wanted to hear got amplified, while all the voices that he didn't want to hear from, these were small ranchers, Native Americans, hunters, hikers, anglers, municipal water suppliers, trade unionists, irrigation farmers. They had their voices diminished and dismissed. And that would, of course, include the DeVotos. In the 1930s, the DeVoto's literary comet took off. They settled in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And in 1935, Bernard was given the honor of writing Harper's Magazine's monthly column, The Easy Chair. This is the oldest feature in American journalism. It gave him gravitas. It also gave him a national platform. And DeVoto also wrote kind of silly, serialized fiction for big popular magazines. He was not proud of it. He did a lot of it under pseudonyms, but it made him a ton of money. So the DeVotos began living a very sort of glamorous lifestyle and having wonderful parties. You can see Avis in the left-hand corner here. Notice her expression at some of the shenanigans that go on at these parties. And it brought literary luminaries into their life like Robert Frost, the poet. But while this glamorous lifestyle that the DeVotos appeared to be living was, very ostentatious, it masked the fact that they were going through some pretty personal and private pain. Robert Frost, pictured here, eating wild berries with Avis and appearing to admire her while Bernard holds the camera. He tried to come between the DeVotos, and at the same time, DeVoto started a relationship with this young woman, Catherine Stern. It was not a physical relationship. They never actually met in person. Kate Stern had tuberculosis, and she wrote Bernard DeVoto a fan letter from an iron lung where she lived out the last days of her life in a sanatorium outside of Poughkeepsie, New York. But over the span of more than a decade, they swapped hundreds and hundreds of very intimate letters. And Avis knew about this, and Avis was okay with it because she knew the private pain that DeVoto was going through, and she was okay with anything that he did to regulate his mood. Part of the reason he was in such pain was his dream was to write the great American novel. And he did write novels, and they got terrible reviews, and they sold abysmally, and he had to accept the fact that he didn't have a great novel in him. He was also somebody who was an outsider, no matter where he was. When he was in Utah, he was too interested in what was happening in Harvard to really fit in, and when he was at Harvard, he was too obsessed with the U.S. West to really fit in there. And no place was he more out on a limb, getting attacked from all sides, a total maverick, a complete freethinker, than politically. In the 1930s, the nation swung far to the left because of the Great Depression and the stock market crash, and a lot of Americans thought that capitalism was done with. And across America, socialist and even communist candidates for public office got millions of votes. And a lot of people, especially in the realm of academia and literature, looked at Soviet Russia as possibly the way of the future, a utopian way of the future. And nobody more vociferously and loudly and pointedly said that they were all stupid than Bernard DeVoto. He wrote that anybody who thought that communism was a good idea, anybody who didn't think Karl Marx was a moron, was suffering from a, quote, imbecile delusion. He had very spicy opinions and was not afraid about expressing them loudly. But that combination put him through some pretty serious depressions, even some suicidal depressions, that putting so much pressure on himself, that being an outsider no matter where he was, that always being out on a limb, always being a maverick, always being a free thinker, it really took its toll on him. And thankfully, Avis got him through. By the 1940s, they had started a family. She provided him the emotional support he needed to get through his depressions. They had 2 boys, Gordon and Mark. And it's in the 40s that the DeVoto literary comet really reaches its great heights. He publishes a trilogy of Western nonfiction. He finds his true voice writing nonfiction about the West. And the first book in this great trilogy that would define his career is this book, The Year of Decision, 1846. And in it, he talks about the grit of soldiers in the Mexican-American War and the plight of persecuted Mormons who fled religious persecution and tried to find religious freedom in Utah, and the Never Say Die Donner Party who got trapped atop the Sierra Nevadas mountains in the winter and survived by cannibalism. This book came out at the nadir of World War II, and it was seen as an allegory for what American soldiers were going through fighting Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan and fascist Italy. And because this book so inspired American soldiers in World War II, it became a smash hit. Bernard's next book, Across the Wide Missouri, would win the Pulitzer Prize. This one worked back in history to the 1830s, to the heyday of the Rocky Mountain fur trade. It told the story of the mountain men. Working back in history meant that Bernard DeVoto's next book, The Course of Empire, which would win the National Book Award, would feature two guys who he affectionately referred to as my boys, his heroes, Lewis and Clark. Bernard DeVoto was such a Lewis and Clark fan, and he wrote so well about Lewis and Clark that he would get fan letters like this from some Boy Scouts in Long Island. On letterhead they had made up, drawn with scenes from the Lewis and Clark expedition and with a map of the Lewis and Clark Trail on it. And these Boy Scouts begged DeVoto, take us with you, guide us along the Lewis and Clark Trail. Because in 1946, that's exactly what Bernard DeVoto planned to do. He was going to take the trip of a lifetime. This was something he had been dreaming about for years. He was going to take Avis and their boys, and they were going to travel from Massachusetts to the Pacific Ocean, following the Lewis and Clark Trail, visiting national parks and public lands. And DeVoto expected to write a column for Harper's Magazine about public lands conservation. And he thought it would be a hopeful column because he had been following in the 1930s what was happening in the West with the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, and how they had been repairing damaged lands in the West. And when the DeVotos went west for research, they did it up. They wanted to talk to everybody they possibly could. They wanted to learn everything they could. Bernard would go out hiking with Forest Service rangers, and he would learn about the wildlife and the plant ecology of the West. Avis would talk to Forest Service rangers also. She would also stop at all the tourist spots. Here they are in Yellowstone. Avis would ride in chairlifts to the top of mountains so she could get panoramic views of the West. Bernard was too afraid of heights to join her. But Bernard would go up flying around with smoke jumpers who took off from right here in Missoula, Montana. They would get out on the water together. That's Avis in the middle of Jenny Lake in Grand Teton National Park. Bernard would float down the Missouri River in eastern Montana with the novelist A.B. Guthrie Jr. But one thing that Bernard would always do wherever he was is he would drop down to his hands and knees and check out the grass because he wanted to know if it was getting overgrazed. And come 1946, the answer to that question was yes, because of Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. Now, those McCarran public lands hearings took on a sadistic turn during World War II while everybody was distracted by the war. He went from dismissing and diminishing the voices of people who dissented from his views on public lands to demonizing them, to saying that they were maybe communists. And he grew so paranoid in the 1940s, saying that America was being infiltrated with communists and that it was his singular mission to expose these communists and to stop them from destroying America, that he became probably the most paranoid politician that we had. And through these public land hearings, where he was amplifying the voices of people he wanted to hear and then demonizing as potential communists the people he didn't want to hear from, small ranchers, Native Americans, hunters, hikers, anglers, municipal water suppliers, wildlife lovers, trade unionists, irrigation farmers. After years and years of collecting this completely rigged testimony, Pat McCarran used that testimony as justification to slash the budget of the grazing service so deep that it could not recover. The grazing service, remember, was created by FDR to fight the Dust Bowl. And Pat McCarran cut its budget so deeply that President Truman combined what was left of it with the corrupt, historically moribund General Land Office to create a new federal agency, a weak federal agency, the Bureau of Land Management. This is the origin of the Bureau of Land Management. It was born in the early summer of 1946. It should have better been called the Bureau of Pat McCarran. Ed Abbey would soon call the BLM the Bureau of Livestock and Mining, which is exactly what McCarran wanted. The DeVotos still go west, thinking they're going to write a hopeful column about public lands conservation. That's their Buick filled with all the supplies they were going to need for 3 months. And at first, their trip is going great. They're stopping at roadside historical markers and taking pictures. But the trip turns tragic when they get to the Dakotas and they see the beginnings of the Garrison Dam. The Garrison Dam on the Missouri River is going to create a reservoir that's going to flood out some 150,000 acres of the homelands of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations, all without their permission. And Devoto is shocked to see this in the middle of the 1900s. He thought that this kind of Native American dispossession was a thing of the 1800s. And he knows from his study of history that the biggest public lands frauds, the biggest public lands scams in American history went hand in hand with this kind of Native American dispossession, because the common denominator is natural resource grabbing, plundering, bonanzas, boom times. And so Devoto realizes that he needs to be on the alert in case something else is being worked up, something else that would lead back to Nevada Senator Pat McCarran, seen here on a reservoir catching a bass. The Devotos get to Miles City, Montana, and they go to the Range Riders Cafe, because Devoto loved to eat, remember? And he knows that the Range Riders Cafe serves maybe the best steak dinner in America. And Bernard will gleefully tell his readers on the Eastern Seaboard that for no amount of money in their time zone can they buy a steak dinner anywhere near as good as the one he can get for $1.75 at the Range Riders. But it's inside there that he eavesdrops on a, quote, very loud, very drunk cattleman. And he gets his confirmation that his hunch was correct. He hears that, yes, there is something else being cooked up, that the tactics that Pat McCarran used against the grazing service are next going to be used against the Forest Service and the Park Service. And so the Devotos transform into investigative journalists, because they think that if they can get the exact details of this plot being worked up, Bernard can write an article about it, they can tell all Americans about it, and maybe they can stop it from happening. So this Lewis and Clark National Park adventure they're on turns into a networking odyssey where they go across the West meeting with people, asking them if they know anything about this plot. In Great Falls, Montana, they meet with Joseph Kinsey Howard, who is very rightfully in the Montana Journalism Hall of Fame. He wrote one of the best books about the state, Montana, High, Wide, and Handsome. He was a Devoto compatriot. In Yosemite, they meet with Ansel Adams, asking, do you know anything going on? They meet with their old friend Wallace Stegner, the novelist whose career Bernard launched by writing rave reviews about his work. But it's in Bernard's hometown of Ogden, Utah, that they get their big break. They meet with this guy, Chet Olson, a Forest Service ranger. A Forest Service ranger who, through the 1930s, led CCC crews by the hundreds up into the Wasatch Mountains. And they replanted trees, and they replanted grass, and they stopped those deadly floods from crashing out of the mountains. And Chet Olson knew that in August 1946, there was going to be a meeting in Salt Lake City of some of the West's biggest cattle ranchers and biggest wool growers. And at that meeting, there was going to be a secret select subcommittee that would meet privately, and they would hash out a legislative agenda that they expected to be introduced to Congress. And all the details that the Devotos had been searching for since the Dakotas, hundreds of miles, thousands of miles, all the details would be in that legislative agenda. And somehow, well, by the way, of course, presiding over this entire meeting is Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. Somehow, Chet Olson got his hands on a transcript of that secret meeting, and he got it into Bernard DeVoto's hands. And what DeVoto read set his stubby hair on fire. The plan was this: to take every acre under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Land Management, around 150 million acres, transfer them to states and sell them off, and then have McCarran-sanctioned crews go and resurvey the national forests. And out of around 136 million acres of national forest land, they hope to transfer out an additional up to 80 million acres, and then repeat the process in national monuments and national parks. So all told, there were as many as 230 million acres of American public land at stake. Bernard DeVoto called it a land grab, the biggest in U.S. history. And he would write, Senator McCarran has been the ablest representative of cattle and sheep interests in Washington against the West and the people of the United States. He put that in the January 1947 issue of Harper's Magazine in an article he titled "The West Against Itself," which was a reference to politicians like McCarran, who, for political gain and short-term profit, would liquidate the natural resources of the West, which is to say, the future of the West. And Devoto broke it down in plain language exactly what was going on. The plan is to get rid of public lands altogether, turning them over to the states, which can be coerced as the federal government cannot be, and eventually to private ownership. This is your land we are talking about. He wrote this, by the way, just a few years after Woody Guthrie had written "This Land is Your Land." That story, The West Against Itself, it did exactly what the Devotos hoped it would. Bernard DeVoto remembered that the article, quote, fused an explosion. It rendered that land grab legislation too radioactive for anybody to touch. It stopped 230 million acres of America's public lands from possibly being sold off. But as the 1940s turned into the 1950s, the land grab would evolve and the tactics would evolve. And Pat McCarran would get a very powerful new ally, or rather, somebody would become very powerful by transforming himself into Pat McCarran. You'll see that when Pat McCarran gets fan mail, it comes with stickers on it that say, "I'm for McCarthy." One of the tough things that historians have had to deal with when writing about the McCarthy era, named for Wisconsin Senator Joe McCarthy, who claimed that America was infiltrated with communists that only he could find and save the country from. One of the challenges that historians have had is there really wasn't that much to Joe McCarthy himself. He didn't have much character. He didn't have consistent values. He didn't have solid principles. The two things that he most wanted were alcohol and attention. But in 1950, he realized he could get that attention by amplifying things that Pat McCarran had said. Remember, McCarran in the 1940s was saying that America was full of communists that only he could get. Joe McCarthy began to say that in the 1950s. The way to figure out what young Republican Joe McCarthy was going to say would be to look at what old Democrat Pat McCarran had just said. Pat McCarran is the godfather of McCarthyism. You don't get McCarthyism without Pat McCarran. And they became a team. Because where Joe McCarthy had a genius for attracting attention and setting the tenor of open debate in America, Pat McCarran had a genius for legislating. And while McCarthy was setting the culture in America, Pat McCarran was passing some of the most oppressive laws in U.S. history. And Joe McCarthy's innovation was a way of speaking. It was rhetorical. He innovated a way of speaking that would achieve a dramatic effect while eliding responsibility. And that way that Joe McCarthy talked of smearing people by inference and allusion and association, that began to get picked up on by McCarran's allies, like this gentleman, J. Elmer Brock, who was at one time the president of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, which was a force behind the land grab. J. Elmer Brock decided to inform on Bernard DeVoto to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, and on his livestock company stationery, J. Elmer Brock tells J. Edgar Hoover that Bernard DeVoto, as far as the sentiments of the stockmen in the West, we would like to see Bernard hanging from a cottonwood limb. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's just venting and blowing off steam. But J. Elmer Brock also included in that letter to J. Edgar Hoover an article that the Wyoming Stock Growers Association had published in their own journal. And in that journal, they wrote that maybe Bernard DeVoto would be better off, quote, or maybe DeVoto, quote, should have a hammer and sickle over his desk. And you see that somebody has underlined that and drawn an arrow to it. Now, if the Wyoming Stock Growers Association had written, DeVoto is a communist, DeVoto could sue them for libel. But if they write that maybe he should have a hammer and sickle over his desk, they achieve that dramatic effect while eliding responsibility. By the way, this is all in Bernard DeVoto's FBI file. And that type of rhetoric, and the fact that the FBI was collecting this kind of stuff, this type of gossip and hearsay and slander and backbiting, that was enormously concerning to Bernard DeVoto, pictured here at his desk with neither a hammer nor a sickle over it. He worried that it was a threat to the Bill of Rights, that it threatened Americans' right to free speech and right to due process. So in late 1949, he wrote the most controversial column of his career, "Due Notice to the FBI." This is one of the first pieces in a national magazine to criticize Joe McCarthy, but more so, he takes the FBI to task for collecting this McCarthyist-style talk, this insinuation and gossip and slander and innuendo and backbiting. And when this article hits, J. Edgar Hoover is furious. As strange as it is to say in the year 2022, if there was one thing most Americans agreed on in the early 1950s, is that the FBI was awesome and that J. Edgar Hoover was an American hero. And he had done awesome work catching kidnappers and murderers and building the FBI. But in the 1950s, the FBI took on these government loyalty investigations, and that ballooned Hoover's power while wilting his accountability. And there's the phrase about what absolute power absolutely does. So J. Edgar Hoover sent out a bulletin about due notice to the FBI to every single FBI headquarters in all 48 states plus all 3 territories. He also launched an investigation into a question that was driving him nuts. Had Bernard DeVoto learned about a specific investigation and therefore learned actual techniques that the FBI was using? I'm not going to give any spoilers because it's in the book and I hope you pick it up, but Hoover failed for a really dumb reason. And at the risk of saying something self-aggrandizing and on camera, I found what Hoover failed to find. The answer is deep inside of DeVoto's archives at Stanford University. I had thought that the person who inspired due notice to the FBI would be like a neighbor of the DeVotos in Cambridge, Massachusetts, maybe a Harvard professor. I was shocked that it turned out to be this guy, Roald Peterson. Born on a North Dakota homestead, he came to Missoula, Montana in the mid-40s. He's in the middle of that photo in front of what is now the post office in downtown Missoula. He came to Missoula to work for the Forest Service as a range ecologist. He went around the state teaching ranchers rotational grazing to conserve grass. This was exactly the type of public servant that Pat McCarran wanted to drive out of government service. And the story of what happened to Roald Peterson, which I learned from tracking down his granddaughter, from looking at files at the Missoula Courthouse and at the Montana Historical Society, the story of what happened to Roald Peterson was baroque and ridiculous and tragic. 2 people who are anonymous to this day accused him of being a communist. They were wrong. They were either inaccurate or they were lying. But because of those 2 anonymous accusations that he was communist, he was investigated. And while he was being investigated, dozens of ranchers of every political stripe from around Montana vouched for Roald. So did the entirety of Montana's congressional delegation. They said he was loyal and helpful and a benefit to the state of Montana. But the stress of going through these investigations was hell on his family. He had married a woman he met at school. She was from New Orleans, and during these investigations, she suffered a psychotic break. And her father had her committed, and I'm not making up the name of this place, her father had her committed to the East Louisiana Asylum for the Insane. And while she was on her way to this literal insane asylum, she talked to a man, and this man decided to tell the FBI his impression of the conversation that they had. The man told the FBI, this is from Roald's FBI file, that the man is, quote, that he thought that Roald was, quote, behaving like a homosexual. And this is at a time when Joe McCarthy is going around the country saying he is going to expose all, quote, communists and queers, trying to conflate them in the American mind, which was high irony. Because working for Joe McCarthy at the time is the gentleman in the front, the infamous attorney Roy Cohn, a gay man who was at that time in love with the gentleman on the other side of Joe McCarthy there, G. David Schein. But for Americans who were not as politically connected as Roy Cohn, the results could be tragic. Because Roald Peterson was accused of being gay, he was investigated by the FBI again. He lost his Forest Service job. He lost his ranch in the Bitterroot Valley. A Montana judge trying to decide custody between an institutionalized mom and a dad falsely accused of being a gay communist put the kids in foster care, and they were sexually abused. Roald Peterson left the United States in shame and his two youngest kids killed themselves. This is the human cost of McCarthyism. And something not too dissimilar happened to Wyoming Senator Lester Hunt. This guy is another Bernard DeVoto conservation ally. Lester Hunt's son was arrested on suspicion of being gay, and two of McCarran and McCarthy's Senate colleagues blackmailed Senator Hunt and told him that if he did not resign, they were going to publicize all over Wyoming that his son had been arrested. And this was 45 years before the brutal murder of gay University of Wyoming student Matthew Shepard. We have all seen some of Lester Hunt's legacy. Lester Hunt was the guy who chose this to be the emblem of Wyoming, the cowboy on the bucking bronco. We see it on the license plates, you see it on the quarters. What DeVoto saw was that a pattern had emerged, that anybody who stood between Pat McCarran and his designs to liquidate natural resources on public lands found themselves harassed, intimidated, persecuted, investigated. And come the 1950s, Pat McCarran had figured out a new way to take resources from public lands and liquidate them and funnel the benefits to his Western cronies. Dams. Multi-million-dollar dams. And dams were and still are, a super complex conservation issue because the economic benefits versus ecological harm can be very hard to balance out. But it became a crisis in the 1950s because to build a dam, you need certain parameters. You need a canyon. And so many dams had already been built, despite the law of diminishing returns kicking in. So many dams had been built that some of the only places left to build dams were inside national park land. And Pat McCarran, using his power on the Interior Department's Appropriations Committee, poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the dam building agency, the Bureau of Reclamation. And that was matched by the Bureau's sometimes rival, sometimes partner agency, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The United States would spend more on water infrastructure than anything except for the military. And Pat McCarran leveraged that pork. So the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers drew up plans to build dams either inside or close enough to flood significant portions of the Grand Canyon in Arizona, and Yellowstone in Wyoming, and the North Fork of the Flathead on the western edge of Glacier Park in Montana, Kings Canyon National Park in California, Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky, Fort Donelson National Battlefield in Tennessee. But the first one to go, the first domino to drop, the first dam that would set precedent to be built was here on the Green River inside Dinosaur National Monument, which straddles the border between Colorado and DeVoto's home state of Utah. If this dam was built, then all the other dams could go forward. And if America could not protect its national parks from being industrially exploited, no other acre of public land stood a chance from being liquidated. And DeVoto knew what he had to do. He had done it before. He would write another blockbuster article, and he would let the American people know what was going on. And he did. And he wanted it to reach more eyeballs than Harper's Magazine, so he put it in the most well-read magazine of the era, the Saturday Evening Post. And he gave it another attention-grabbing headline, "Shall we let them ruin our national parks?" DeVoto brought the threat that dams posed to national parks and all public lands to the American attention. He was the person who founded this idea that dams were not always a good thing and there had to be a line drawn somewhere. And what happened when Bernard DeVoto exposed something else that ultimately Pat McCarran was behind? It got DeVoto attacked by Pat McCarran's understudy, Joe McCarthy. In the lead up to the 1952 presidential election, Joe McCarthy, stumping for candidate Eisenhower, attacked Bernard DeVoto more viciously and more conspicuously than anybody else, using, by the way, information that was in Bernard DeVoto's FBI file. But where Pat McCarran was a genius when it came to getting back at his enemies, when Joe McCarthy goes on national TV to attack Bernard DeVoto, and I hope the AV, the multimedia works here, when Joe McCarthy on national TV tries to attack Bernard DeVoto, he calls him
Richard DeVoto.
In case you didn't catch that, Joe McCarthy calls Bernard DeVoto Richard DeVoto.
Richard DeVoto.
But unfortunately, Joe McCarthy is not done. Joe McCarthy begins attacking magazines that publish Bernard DeVoto's conservation writings, and he begins to get blacklisted. And this is a crisis for conservation because the DeVotos are the most important spokespeople of their era for public lands conservation. It's also a crisis for the DeVoto family because if DeVoto can't get published, they can't keep a roof over their head. His writing was their livelihood. Fortunately, Bernard had Avis, and Avis had Bernard, and they began working more closely together than ever before, collaborating on brainstorming new types of story ideas that he could write, sometimes under a pseudonym, to compensate for his getting blacklisted. Avis suggested that he write about kitchen knives. And he did, under his own name, in Harper's Magazine. And in 1952, that got him a fan letter from an aspiring cookbook author living in Paris, Julia Child. One of the things that Avis did for Bernard was she answered a lot of his fan mail. So she wrote Julia back, and they became best friends for life. And Julia Child confided to Avis that she had a dream of writing an epic cookbook of French recipes for an American audience. And Avis, who, remember, she loves cooking. And she promises Julia, because she's so excited by this idea, she's so excited by this idea that she promises Julia that she will use Bernard's contacts in the publishing industry to get her a book deal. Avis promises to make Julia Child a star. Because this format is a little bit show and tell, I want to show a little bit about the depth and the feeling behind this friendship between the DeVotos and the Child, which came into the DeVotos' life at a real low point in their fight for public lands. The Childs added the DeVotos to a list of really wonderful special friends to whom they would send valentines every year, these handmade valentines. And Paul Child, Julia's husband, who was a very talented artist, he would make these valentines. So he made this one of sort of this, Victorian type dramatic scene. Sometimes the valentines would be pretty risque. Here they are in the bathtub together. Sometimes they would be very intricate and ornate. This valentine that Paul Child hand painted looks like it's a stained glass window. Sometimes Paul's painting of them could be kind of risque. Julia snapped this photo of him painting en plein air, shall we say. This is a poem that Paul Child wrote on the back of that valentine, and you'll notice that the first letter of each line spells from top to bottom to Avis and Bernard. This is a photograph of Julia Child's kitchen in France in 1953. You'll notice on the top shelf, where you might expect to find a cookbook, there is instead Bernard DeVoto's book, The Course of Empire. This is a collection of cards for organizations that Bernard DeVoto belonged to, and there's the ones you would expect. There's his National Parks Lifetime Pass, there's his Sierra Club membership card, there's his Outdoor Writers Association of America membership card, and up there in the top corner is his membership card for the cooking school that Julia Child taught in Paris, L'École des Trois Gourmands. This friendship between the DeVotos and the Childs is very famous. It's very well known, and it should be, because it's one of the great friendships in American history, and it's extremely well documented, and it's wonderful, and it's charming. But this friendship, particularly between Avis DeVoto and Julia Child, what people don't realize about it, what people don't understand about it, is that this friendship came together. This friendship was fused inside the crucible of the DeVotos' McCarthy-era fight to save our national parks and public lands. And the Childs weren't the only new friends and allies to come into the DeVotos' lives because of their crusade. I'm going to let this logger in the Bitterroot Mountains introduce the next one. He says, "I'll be goddamned, I never thought I'd meet Adlai Stevenson here." Adlai Stevenson was the Democratic nominee for president in 1952 and 1956, and in 1954, he asked Bernard DeVoto to meet him in Missoula, Montana, in secret, to give him a field lesson in conservation. So Bernard took him into the Bitterroot Mountains and taught him about chain smoking. I'm joking. He taught him about his passion, about rangeland health. Grass holds the soil. Friends, this is grassroots politics. And you can see that Stevenson starts to get it. Somebody has left a sloppy campsite, and he yells out, "Clean it up, you son of a bitch." But what Bernard DeVoto impresses on Stevenson is that the number one reason for public lands conservation is to protect the sources of clean, cold water, which is the lifeblood of the West. And Stevenson fulfills a lifelong dream. He goes trout fishing not too far from those cedars on the top of the Bitterroot Mountains. If Stevenson is president, Bernard DeVoto is probably going to be as Secretary of Agriculture or Secretary of the Interior. But DeVoto is thinking ahead just in case Stevenson is not the guy to get his public lands conservation ideas into the White House. Bernard is also keeping up a conservation correspondence with his senator in Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. But that's all in the future. Come 1955, the crisis situation in the West is that river, the Green River, and whether dams are going to be built on it inside Dinosaur National Monument, taking a landscape that looks like that and making it look like this. The American people are against this. Letters to members of Congress about potentially damming Dinosaur National Monument are 80-1 against it. But the dams still have all the momentum they need to get built because nobody better uses the mechanisms of minority power in government better than Pat McCarran. And Pat McCarran is also using all the cultural force of McCarthyism. People who are against these dams get called disloyal, apologists, socialist maybe, communist maybe, weak, gay. At the height of this dam fight, even Paul Child comes under suspicion. Paul Child works for the State Department, and that's the whole reason that Julia Child was in France in the first place learning cooking. Paul Child is accused of being gay. Even this guy who has so much documentation and so obviously and plainly is in love with and devoted to Julia Child, he gets investigated. And Avis DeVoto will wonder in a dark moment whether he got investigated as a way of McCarran and McCarthy's people getting back at the DeVotos for their fight for public lands conservation. And it all takes a real toll on Bernard DeVoto. These years of struggle, these years of fight, the nastiness of the McCarthy era. He doesn't help himself out because he smokes all the time. He drinks a ton. He hardly ever sleeps. He works all the time. But in November 1955, he gets an opportunity that he's been looking for. He hopes to rise above the political fray. He hopes to take his message to the American people, to a mass American audience. He hopes to sway public opinion. He is asked to go on a TV show in New York City called Adventure, which is a joint operation between CBS and the Museum of Natural History. He is asked to tell the story of Mesa Verde National Park. This is the home of the ancestral Pueblans, Westerners who first figured out the value of land conservation. And the ancestral Pueblans lived for centuries. They built the tallest skyscrapers in North America till Chicago in the 1880s. But around the year 1200, centuries before Columbus ever sailed, they vanished. And tree rings told the story that the climate warmed a little bit and mega droughts struck. And when those droughts hit, the ancestral Pueblans all vanished. And DeVoto hoped that this story, this parable of a civilization in the U.S. West that vanished when it overextended its water supply, would shift public opinion about building dams in the West toward caution and conservation and preservation. And DeVoto wanted to put everything into this broadcast. He wanted to leave nothing on the field. He wanted to take his lifetime of learning about the West and traveling around the West and talking to Westerners and doing his research and bringing in new allies into the fight for the West, including that guy in the hat right there. That is book publisher Alfred Knopf, who Bernard DeVoto brought around to his cause. All the cigarettes that he had smoked in the West, all the horsing around he had done with his buddy Chet Olson in the West. This is the point in my presentation when, as much as I don't want to give any spoilers, I'm not clever enough to have figured out a way to not let you know that Benny DeVoto doesn't make it. He dies on November 13th, 1955. You'll have to read the book for the details. But I can tell you that had he lived until the end of that month, he would have seen headlines like this: a victory for Bernard DeVoto. He convinced the Eisenhower administration to reverse itself and to not build dams inside Dinosaur National Monument. This upheld the sanctity of the National Park Service. And by upholding the sanctity of the National Park Service, it upheld the precedent of not liquidating and exploiting every acre of federally reserved lands, public and tribal. The credit certainly goes to Bernard DeVoto, but it should equally go to Avis DeVoto, because without Avis, there never would have been Bernard DeVoto. They were a team. They were a true partnership. And when DeVoto died when he was 58, Avis was only 51, and she was absolutely devastated because not only had she lost her romantic partner, but she also lost her professional partner. She was the one who edited him and proofread and fact-checked and indexed and answered his fan mail. She also lost that professional partnership, and she was devastated, and she was wondering what would become of her, what she would do with the rest of her life. Fortunately, Avis had one of history's great best friends, Julia Child, and Julia Child rushed Avis a plane ticket to come to Europe, and Julia took Avis around Europe and cooked her lavish meals to try to heal her heart. And Avis realized that although she would never find romantic love again, that professional part of her relationship with Devoto, the professional skills that she lent to him, she could lend them to Julia Child. And that's what she did. She kept her promise to make Julia Child a star. She would copy edit Julia Child and brainstorm ideas with her and index her work and fact check it and proofread it. And it's because of Avis that these books got published, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, Volumes 1 and 2. If you look at the acknowledgments, you'll see lovely tributes that Julia wrote to Avis, which I won't take up your time with right now. Through this presentation, I have shown you some video of Bernard DeVoto from a home movie that was lost in a university archive for the better part of 70 years. I was never able to find any video footage of Avis DeVoto. So the closest I can show you of animate Avis is from the big screen. With the laws of fair use on my side. This is Deborah Rush in the 2009 movie Julie and Julia opposite Meryl Streep. She is depicting Avis DeVoto. And right now on HBO Max is a show called Julia with Bebe Neuwirth playing Avis DeVoto. This is as close as we're going to get to seeing what Avis DeVoto looked like on TV. This is one of the great friendships in American history. When Avis was elderly, she joined with some other women in her adopted hometown of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they stopped a plan to chainsaw down these handsome London plane trees, and they got that park in the background built. That is JFK Memorial Park. And for her efforts in the mid-1980s, the Cambridge City Council etched Avis's name into a ledge in Harvard Square at her insistence. It also included Bernard's name. So at the corner of Brattle and Story, you can find this. It says Bernard and Avis DeVoto, Friends of Cambridge Conservation. But of course, this isn't the only place where the DeVotos are publicly honored. There's also the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. And that was dedicated in September 1962. This is the dedication ceremony. You can see Avis in the bottom left there. Speaking is Forest Service Ranger Chet Olson, their great friend and source. The person who escorted Avis to this dedication ceremony was Montana Senator Lee Metcalf, seen there on the front page of the Missoulian with her. And at that ceremony, Lee Metcalf read aloud a special message to Avis from President Kennedy. And President Kennedy honored Avis DeVoto, and he talked about how inspired he had been by Bernard DeVoto's works. And Avis would write President Kennedy back. She would also visit the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove one more time. After Bernard DeVoto died, his ashes were spread over the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove by airplane, a smoke jumper plane that took off from Johnson Flying Service in Missoula. And Mark DeVoto, their youngest son, pictured there at the dedication ceremony, he brought Avis's ashes there in 2003 and scattered them. So Mark DeVoto brought his parents back together again, symbolically and literally. Mark DeVoto brought Bernard and Avis DeVoto back together again. And when Avis wrote President Kennedy in September 1962, she offered him some advice. She was not shy about offering advice. But as two of the most important people to ever put pen to paper in the 20th century, Bernard DeVoto and Julia Child, had learned it was always wise to take advice from Avis DeVoto. And what she advised President Kennedy to do was to someday visit the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. She told President Kennedy that although there were more awesomely scenic places in the United States, she had never found a place at once so majestic and so peaceful. And I feel like that's good advice to wind this talk down on. If you are ever fortunate enough to be traveling on Highway 12 near the border of Montana and Idaho, you should visit the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove because you'll find that it's everything that Avis said. And even if you're not fortunate enough to be able to stop there, even if all you do is take note of the sign as you're passing by, now you know there's a pretty interesting story behind it. Thank you very much.